Welcome back, everyone, to Issues of Faith. We have with us Reverend Ed Sanders, senior servant and founder of the Metropolitan Interdenominational Church here in Nashville. We're talking about the First Response Center, which is an HIV/AIDS service work that you do.
Yes.
You said in the last segment, you started it. The congregation's 41 years old. You started this 38 years ago after the first person died in your congregation. It was from AIDS.
Yes.
And so, how tough was that? I mean, because it's been that some churches have been very reluctant to get into that world, and it has been difficult. How tough was that when you started this network?
Well, I think by far one of the tougher issues that you have to address when you're talking about HIV and AIDS is the whole issue of human sexuality. And it didn't take HIV, though, to turn that into a problematic subject within the church. But it did take HIV for us to begin to have to talk about it in a way that challenged how we had allowed ourselves to be dismissive, allowed ourselves being in a posture where very often people were being discounted in terms of their human value and worth because of some particular aspect of their personhood. Over time, we came to realize that that was not exclusively the way in which the disease was being transmitted. And it was an important conversation to have with clergy. There's a way in which I contend all the time that that every human being is the byproduct of the hand of God. The fingerprint of God is on all of us. And there's a way in which we have to understand that there is no way that you could ever see in the character of God anything which would translate into a mistake in terms of how a human being has come to be who they are.
And so you made this a major ministry in your church. How does it work? What is it you do?
Well, we say that we are community believers, inclusive of all and alienating to none, leading the way to spiritual growth by sharing God's love with the world. One of the things that we also try very much to do is to help people to understand where there's common ground. In too many instances, fragmentation and division is the byproduct of the way in which we've allowed ourselves to be sucked into drawing such hard lines of demarcation and difference between who we are in the Judeo-Christian tradition and who others are in other faith traditions. I often have to say to people, I said, it's not as though you go around and look at other faith traditions. You take the Ten Commandments, for instance. I remember when there was a great conversation about whether or not Ten Commandments should be hung in public places. I always tell people I was never concerned about whether it was hung on the walls. The issue was, did people have it in their hearts? And what I found myself saying to folks sometimes, you can go and look at almost all the religious traditions of the world. No one says, thou shalt kill, thou shalt steal, thou shalt commit adultery. Those principles are principles of human life that cut across what we end up sometimes allowing to be differences, and in some instances even petty differences. But the issue of life and death is one that is always a part of the equation of trying to deal with how we see ourselves in spiritual terms. And one of the things that we have discovered is that the ways in which people are most responsive to these issues, like infectious diseases of HIV and even with COVID, is when people come to the table with an altruistic kind of perspective. They come to the table because their lives have been touched. Their experience has been impacted, that they have found themselves having to deal with the honest realities of how a loved one has ceased to be a part of our lives. And
do you worry that the divisive, vitriolic nature of our discourse now pushes people away from religion? What do you think about that?
Well, what I find to be most frightening about that right now is the way in which people in some religious sectors have allowed themselves to fall into the trap of trying to modify, adapt the ways in which they read the Word of God and the way in which they have developed their understanding of what the Word of God means. The Word of God, I always have to say to people, is pro the idea of there being value, of there being meaning and purpose in every life. But when you get to where you think you can write off or somehow negate the true value of another human being, then you've set the stage for the way in which you'll even allow your religious perspectives. So the sermon I have preached probably most in the midst of the last 2 years is a sermon entitled Myths, Lies, and Misrepresentations of the Truth. And I think that what we have as a problem in the faith community is there's so much of who we see ourselves as being in relationship to our faith is very often built upon myths, and in other instances, lies. I mean, we clearly know that in terms of this country and its history when you think about the kinds of genocidal assaults that took place in relationship to indigenous people in these United States of America, something that we don't like to pay a lot of attention to. We don't like to pay a lot of attention to the ways in which persons were brought here in shackles and in chains and a part of the Middle Passage that led to the reality of people who are blessed with this ebony glow that I carry with me every day, where it became a part of the citizenry of this country. There's a way in which we find ourselves having to deal with the fact that we have skirted the issues. We have chosen not to deal forthrightly with the problems. They continue to haunt us. They continue to undermine the ways in which the potentials, we have tremendous potential, but those potentials are very often undermined by petty ways of thinking, what I refer to sometimes as being dysfunctional belief systems. Belief is powerful, whether it is functional or dysfunctional, whether it is well-focused or ill-focused.
You were here during the civil rights movement.
Oh, yes, I was.
A divisive time.
Yes, yes.
What do you think about the time we're in now?
Yes.
How optimistic are you about, where we are going forward?
Well, it's a time when we really can appreciate and need to make sure we revive and we take advantage of much of what was learned in that period that was called the Civil Rights Movement. I always like to quote Martin Luther King Jr. in that regard, because Martin Luther King Jr. did not like the language of Civil Rights Movement. He liked to refer to it as the soul force movement. He very much made it clear that he felt like the souls of America, the soul of America was in jeopardy because people were allowing hatred, they were allowing prejudice and bigotry, they were allowing their misconceptions to guide the ways in which people were thinking. When you think about just in the last few days, the Emmett Till, I guess it's now a piece of legislation that was signed just in the last couple of days by President Biden. There's a way in which you think about that. That's 70 years ago. But 70 years ago, I want you to know, I remember very clearly, it was something that was most unsettling to me. I remember seeing the picture of Emmett Till on the cover of Ebony and Jet magazines. I remember the fear that it installed in me and the way in which it translated into my probably being reluctant and probably thinking in compromising terms about who I was and what my potentials in life could be.
We only have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
And I want to get back to that AIDS, the first response center.
Yes,
but I love it's all interesting. And I'm probably going to have to cut you off here. But people think this AIDS is kind of behind us. It's solved. What do you say to that?
No, it's not behind us at all. And as a matter of fact, it's that mindset that makes us perhaps more vulnerable than we've ever been. There's a way in which we need to be clear about the fact that when you have a problem that is as clearly still a part of our everyday reality that people are treating as though it doesn't any longer exist, that means our vulnerability is greater. We let our guard down, and when you let your guard down, that means that the likelihood of us having a resurgence of this disease is one that's all around us. It's not something we can think of in terms of being isolated with any one particular people who would have any particular aspect of who they are that is outside of the heteronormative kind of ways of thinking. but rather end up representing the uniqueness that God has allowed there to be amongst all of us. It seems to me that anybody ought to be able to see and understand that God's hand in terms of the creation of humankind had the capacity to allow us to have our unique differences, but at the same time, 98% of who we are is always the same. We've even discovered that, by the way, in the HIV research and in the vaccine research around COVID-19, is that it was important more than anything to speak to people in terms of their fears and their beliefs. It was really interesting because
that's how we need to speak to people now, in terms of their beliefs.
And there is no great difference.
There's no great difference.
Yeah.
Reverend Sanders, it's great to talk to you. We covered a lot of territory. We covered coronavirus, AIDS, and current discord. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Reverend Edwin Sanders, thanks to all of you for watching. Have a great day, everybody.